Well, welcome. I'm Joanna Cohn, Director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our monthly Innovations in Global Tobacco Control lecture series. And I'm particularly thrilled to be able to introduce today Dr. Meghan Moran. So Meghan did... I'll just wait a second. You can hear me through the mic, though. Meghan completed her graduate training, or master's and PhD in communications at the University of Southern California, and has been here at Hopkins in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society as an assistant professor since 2015. So Meghan's interests are in communications, and particularly health communications, and has particular interests in both persuasion and social influence. And she looks at that at the individual level, so looking at how media and communications can persuade and influence people, as well as looking at it at the macro level, looking at health communication in society. So she's been particularly interested in media and pop culture, so we're really happy that she's going to be talking to us about that today. And she's been looking at that particularly in the area of tobacco control, with the goal of thinking about how we can improve our own health communications in that area. So I think I'm going to hand it over to Meghan and welcome her to talk to us about pop culture and media and influence in tobacco control. So welcome and thanks for being here.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here. I am super excited to talk about some of the work I've been doing. Sure, is this better? Yeah? Okay, let's see. I don't know why this is, we'll just skip back through about half of my slides and then get started. Okay, here we go. Title slides. So before I get started, I just want to acknowledge some of the many collaborators and partners, Caitlin Weiger and Mary Cunningham, two of the research assistants on the work I'm going to be presenting today. But I also see Jenny Brown and Joni Rivera, who have worked on some related work that I won't discuss today. Co-authors on some of our papers, and then acknowledge the funding for this work, which is through NIDA and FDA Center for Tobacco Products. So I think we all know that young people are exposed to pro-tobacco communications in a variety of ways. Social media, through the music they listen to, television, movies, celebrities, their friends, and also pro-tobacco marketing. There's pretty clear evidence that exposure to pro-tobacco communications in these forms influences youth tobacco use outcomes. And so because of this, it's a regulatory priority for FDA Center for Tobacco Products, which kind of very clearly specifies a need for research in the area of how marketing affects consumer product perceptions, and then how can we more effectively communicate about the risks and harms of tobacco products. So in order for us to kind of move further in this endeavor, we really need to think about what communication is. How does it work? What does it do? The traditional model of communication, kind of like if you've ever taken Com 101, this is probably the model you get, is who says what, to whom, through what channel, and with what effect. So these are kind of like the key variables that we're looking at here. But like I said, this model is kind of traditional and a bit outdated. Thinking about how we can study communication to further tobacco control efforts, it doesn't quite give us what we need. There's two key challenges here. First is that what is said is not always what is heard, okay? So the communicator may be trying to communicate one thing, but the audience members may hear many different meanings from the words or images that they are exposed to. And then the more kind of interesting problem is that what is said is often complex, layered, and connected to a broader system of cultural meaning. So as Joanna said, I was trained in communication. That means I took a lot of classes in like cultural studies and kind of this more esoteric way of thinking about communication. So if you indulge me for a minute, now's the part of the talk where I kind of divert into a little bit of semiotics. What does it mean to communicate? Any piece of communication has kind of different layers of meaning. The denoted message is the explicit, direct, manifest content, okay? And the connoted message is more implicit, it's indirect, it's latent, and this is the meaning that's really reliant on a shared sociocultural understanding, okay? So let's take a look at this Grizzly ad. This is for Grizzly Smokeless Tobacco. We can think about different signs in this ad, okay? This all comes from Roland Barthes' work. He proposes that any piece of communication has a signifier, a signified, and together they form a sign. So the denoted meaning in this ad, if we look at the word minivan, okay, the ad says, never let a minivan pass you on the highway, because that would just be terrible. But if we look at the word minivan, right, the signifier is literally the letters on the page, okay? And the signified, what it means is like an actual car, a vehicle, a minivan. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. We may be thinking of different colors of minivans, but we probably all get the same kind of denoted meaning here, right? The connoted meaning is more complex, okay? So here, the second layer of meaning, you have the minivan, right? Like an actual minivan. But what is the cultural value of a minivan? I have a couple suggestions, but you may have other cultural ideas of what a minivan means. Is it associated with moms and suburbia, being uncool, being unmasculine, right? There's some type of value attached to a minivan, which makes it unattractive for the audience in this ad. And I just want to point out, this ad was placed in Car and Driver magazine, right? So it's a very particular audience segment. Probably mostly men, obviously interested in cars and driving, and probably interested in the ways in which cars maybe represent masculinity. Okay, so you see here how there's kind of this whole second level of meaning that really relies on the fact that as a culture, we sort of get that minivan means something. Whether we agree with it, whether we think that it's sexist or stereotypical, is kind of secondary to the fact that we all sort of get what this ad is going for. So ultimately, Grizzly is constructed as a new sign. By positioning their brand in opposition to a minivan, they're able to construct Grizzly, the product, and the brand name as Grizzly, the brand, which means masculinity, ruggedness, virility. And the product and the brand name are now kind of stand-ins for these attributes, okay? So if we think about communications in this way, it opens up two new lines of inquiry for how we should be approaching our tobacco regulatory science in this area. So first, the question is, how do tobacco companies tap into this shared cultural meaning to produce the connoted meaning of their ads? Okay, so what exactly are they doing? What are the themes and the values that they are communicating in their marketing? And then second, the more complex question is, how does this broader cultural system, the system that tells us that minivan means these certain things, how is that produced? How does it operate to construct this meaning that the tobacco companies are using in their marketing? So I'm going to kind of begin to address both of these questions, presenting two different lines of research that I and my collaborators and the students on the team have been working on. So first is how tobacco marketing, in particular American spirit marketing, constructs health through the use of eco-friendly and nature-related messages and themes. And then the second line of work I'll talk about is how youth cultural systems are produced and how they're related to tobacco product use or the denormalization of tobacco products in some cases. So, starting with the American Spirit Study, in 2015, the FDA sent a warning letter to Natural American Spirit, in addition to a couple other brands, for use of the terms additive-free and natural in their advertising, telling them that these terms are misleading to consumers and to stop using them. So here's a couple American Spirit ads that use both of these terms, right? 100% additive-free natural tobacco. I want you to take a look at the full ad, okay? And think about how, if we remove these terms, as FDA is requesting, how much of the meaning changes? Do we still get an image of natural, of additive-free, or of health? That's a question that I don't have the answers to yet, but it's something that we need to be thinking about, because if you look here, there's a variety of other tactics being used that could potentially convey the very same product qualities, right? Like the tobacco packs have seemingly literally been picked from the ground the way that one might pick a carrot or something. Ingredients, organic tobacco and organic menthol, essentially implying that this is the only thing in there that is no additives. Use of the word natural in the brand name, which the company is still allowed to use, and so forth. So to better understand what's going on, we wanted to kind of just describe the scene. We conducted a content analysis of American Spirit print ads and direct mail ads that were marketed between 2010 and 2015. We downloaded them from an archive called trinketsandtrash.org, which I'll just kind of put in a pitch for them. It's a really fantastic archive, not unlike the TPACS archive that IGTC has. They host just about every tobacco ad that they can find. So it ultimately resulted in 142 unique ads, and we coded for a variety of imagery, plants, wildlife, pictures of farms, pictures of water, and seeds, textual references to farming, sustainability, to US grown tobacco, and to local or small farms in particular. And then we also looked at specific text descriptors, including natural and additive-free, the two terms that are now restricted, organic, whole leaf, tobacco plus water, and fresh, okay? We trained 3 coders to kappa greater than 0.8 reliability, and we double coded all of the ads with a percentage agreement of 97.4, and then we reconciled the few discrepancies in person. So what did we find? So note that this was before the warning letter sent by FDA, before all of that was resolved. So we saw an awful lot of natural and additive-free in over 2/3 of the ads. But then we also saw a fair amount of use of organic in just over a quarter of ads, of the term tobacco and water or tobacco plus water. References to whole leaf tobacco in about 17% of the ads, and then fewer, and this was primarily in the menthol ads, a few references to the product being fresh. Just to give you another sense of what these messages look like, right? The tobacco and water message right there. Cigarettes made with organic tobacco, okay? So this is kind of how some of those other terms are being used in the ads. In terms of broader textual references, we saw in 39.4% of the ads references to eco-friendly or sustainable growing or business practices. Just under a quarter of ads had references to the farms or the farmers who grow the tobacco. 14.8% referenced the fact that the tobacco was US grown, and 2.8%, so far fewer, referenced the fact that tobacco was grown in local or small farms, or that the company itself was a small business. So here's what some of those tactics look like. Focusing on the left, the kind of eco-friendly or sustainable messaging, you can see on the bottom left a little postcard asking the smokers to hold on to their butts, right? So there's a lot of messaging about tobacco litter that we saw, encouraging consumers to not litter their butts, you know, which is a good message. You know, if you're gonna smoke, don't throw it away, but it's a little bit insidious and kind of that higher level value and meaning it's attaching to the product. The top left is a direct mail ad that links Natural American Spirit cigarettes to a variety of groups and organizations that are devoted to preserving the environment. And then on the right, you can see just another reference to US grown tobacco. So finally, in terms of the imagery that we saw, over half of the ads had images of plants, trees, leaves. Just about a quarter had images of farms or farmers. Again, just under a quarter, pictures of water. And then far fewer had images of wildlife or seeds. So you can see here, this was our favorite ad, I think, as a group on the left. One of the research assistants said, if it wasn't for tobacco, I could see myself hanging it in my kitchen. And I could too. I think it's very, very pretty. With a picture of the mint that they use in their menthol cigarette. And then again, with the tobacco, you know, that they grew in the ground, being pulled from the ground by a farmer who grew it himself, okay? So this was a first step in a broader process. Now that we have an idea of what the scene looks like and we're able to describe the tactics that are being used and at what prevalence, we're able to go a little bit further. So we know from research in other arenas that these types of marketing tactics result in increased health perceptions, which would probably translate in the context of tobacco to like decreased risk perceptions, perceptions of better taste, perceptions of higher quality, and a willingness to pay more for the product. There's also some research that has shown that consumers of American Spirit cigarettes think that their cigarette is safer than other brands. So to kind of connect those two pieces together, I, with Dr. Ryan Kennedy and Lisa Lagasse at the IGTC, plus collaborators at a few other institutions, are moving forward with a project where we will experimentally manipulate the presence or absence of some of these features in the ads to really understand how they contribute to consumer perceptions of the product. We plan to launch that survey early summer, late spring. So this kind of tells us a bit about the connotated meaning of certain images, right? How a plant could potentially signify health, purity, so forth to consumers. But there's this whole other layer to advertising and how it works culturally. I have two quotes from cultural theorists that I find really apt here. Advertising is a system of symbols synthesized from the entire range of culturally determined ways of knowing. Advertising is also a conduit through which meaning constantly pours from the culturally constituted world to consumer goods. Through advertising, old and new goods continually give up old meanings and take on new ones. Okay, so this really is kind of what I'm trying to push for is thinking about advertising not just as kind of like an isolated image or message, but really the fact that it connects to a broader system, right? So the American Spirit ads featuring farms and plants don't mean anything unless as a culture we place some type of meaning or value on farms and plants. And it's probable that that meaning relates to health and purity and so forth. this is a chart just kind of describing a bunch of different functions of advertising more concretely. You have advertising that focuses on the utility value of the product. So I have a camel ad here. It says, camels don't affect my nerves in the least. So really just talking very concretely about what the product can do for the consumer. You also have advertising that connects more ephemeral, intangible attributes to a product. So this ad is for Lucky cigarettes, be happy, go lucky, kind of implying that if you use this product, you will be happy, that it's that type of outcome, which is, you know, much less concrete. Then you have advertising that attempts to build relationships with consumers. There's a really great series of ads for Tareyton cigarettes. This was right about the time like after the first Surgeon General's warning came out, so a lot of smokers were facing kind of like fear and ambiguity about their use of this now known deadly product. So this ad reads, us Tareyton smokers would rather fight than switch. Get your friends to join Unswitchables. Give Tareytons for Christmas. Okay, so really like trying to connect with the consumer and relate to them in that way and create this like body of consumers who uses the product that is somehow similar. Then you get advertising that really attempts to align a product with a certain lifestyle, group, or situation. Virginia Slims, with the You've Come a Long Way Baby campaign, does a really good job here trying to align their product with the feminist movement as kind of a signal for, you know, a modern woman's feminist beliefs. And then finally, you have advertising that really kind of sets up the product to be used as a form of identity construction or identity presentation. So Camel had an ad campaign called The Farm, in which they really drove to align their brand with like indie rock culture. Because they used cartoon imagery in this ad, which was like this kind of big pull-out feature in Rolling Stone magazine, they actually were, I believe, fined for it. But what they were going for was very clear here. It was trying to set up Camel as a product that if one was aligned with this kind of indie rock, cool, hipster culture, that this was the product for you, and that if you used Camel cigarettes, right, you would kind of be letting other people know that you're in on this subculture. Okay, so again, when we think about the advertising at like the latter end of the spectrum, and how it works, we really can't understand it without considering what the broader cultural system that these ads tap into looks like. So this takes me to kind of the second line of work I want to talk about today, which relates to youth cultural systems and how they relate to tobacco use, how they value or devalue tobacco use. Consumer products, as I mentioned, are a resource for identity construction and presentation. Like any product, not just cigarettes, like the whole like Mac versus PC thing, right? Like the kind of car that we drive. The products that we use oftentimes say something about who we are. And in many cases, consumers use these products as a way to sort of put together and assemble their identity. I have just two examples on the left of products that have really strong brand communities. A brand community is a community, subculture, social group that comes together over shared use of a certain brand. So identifying themselves as users of a brand. So Harley-Davidson is one, right, where the brand will sponsor kind of rides for people, and it's this whole kind of culture of being a Harley-Davidson user. And then at the bottom, Jeep, which has a very similar thing too, where you can go to these Jeep jamborees with other Jeep users, riders, drivers, and kind of bond over your shared use of this product. And the way this is set up, right, like riding a Harley or driving a Jeep, right? It means something. So in and of itself, use of these products is kind of associated with its own identity. But then, and this is a bit more common, products are used to represent who we are. So at the bottom right, the Marlboro Man is kind of this classic symbol of masculinity, of ruggedness, and so use of this product can signify those qualities to other people. Does anybody know what this top right image is? It's a bear trap, but not for bears. Yeah. Yeah. So this was it was kind of a I don't know, like a guerrilla art project, so to speak, in Brooklyn, I believe, in which these hipster traps were placed, featuring kind of just very stereotypical, I guess, hipster products, of which American Spirit is here. So you can just kind of think about American Spirit as a signifier of one's cultural alignment as a hipster, compared to Marlboro, right? And how using these products may communicate two very different things about who one is to those around them. So essentially, these all connect to the idea of social identity. Social identity is the identity that we develop as members of groups, cultural categories, right? Hipster, or I don't know, outdoorsy man, or Jeep user, Jeep driver, okay? These are all social identities. They may be connected to our demographic characteristics, like your gender, or your ethnicity, or your age group, where you live, the activities that you engage in, right? You may have a social identity as a student, or as a professor, or specifically as a Hopkins student, right? And it might be different than what it means to be a Harvard student or a Maryland student, okay? So we have multiple social identities, and these identities garner meaning through, again, connection to a larger cultural system. So it means something to be a Hopkins student as compared to a UCLA student, for example. For young people, their peer crowd turns out to be a very important source of social identity. So a peer crowd is a reputation-based subculture or group with shared norms, values, styles, and behaviors. I often think that like a subculture is kind of like the most accessible way to think about what a peer crowd is. But it's not necessarily subcultural. You'll see that there's a peer crowd that I'll talk about that's like literally called mainstream. But it's really just kind of like that cultural group that you belong to. And I think one of the most important characteristics here that I just want to emphasize is that a peer crowd is different than like your peer group. So it's macro level. It's not just a young person's clique of friends that they go to school with. It's the fact that the clique of friends that they have, maybe they're all jocks, looks very similar to the jocks at the next school over and the jocks across the country, that there are these kind of like shared cultural values and norms that connect all of the different young people through their shared identification with this crowd. So first I just want to talk about what some of the peer crowds are that we're seeing in the literature. Adam Leventhal at the University of Southern California conducted a study of adolescents in Los Angeles. It's a longitudinal study, and in wave one, there's a question that asks the young people to write in the group that they most identify with. So we got that data, and Caitlin and Mary and I spent like 8 months at least, just sifting through these thousands of open-ended responses to figure out what the kind of shared crowds were that these young people were reporting. So what we found after our coding, we wound up with this whole slew of different crowds. And just as a note, like, consider this like somewhat preliminary. We'll probably do a little bit of work collapsing some of the crowds, and the names are definitely works in progress. We typically took names from what the youth themselves reported. So on the left are kind of the names that we gave the crowds, and on the right you have example responses. So these are direct quotes from the young people, and then you can see the size of the crowd in the middle column. So we have an alternative crowd, which were young people who said they were hippies, hipsters, Tumblr geeks, bloggers. We have a subset of an alternative music crowd, which were people who were kind of like specifically music focused: goth, emo, metal, scene, rocker. Academic, which were people who really kind of just talked about their identity in terms of the school activities that they participated in, whether it was band or whether it was just the fact that they were smart. There was a group of people who just identified with their ethnic group. They said things like Asians is my group, or the Mexican group is my crowd. Deviants, again, do not like this name. It's kind of commonly used in the literature, but it's a bit judgmental. But these young people self-reported as burnouts, drug addicts, trouble group, dangerous. We had a lot of self-reported nerds. You can see it was like our third biggest group who self-identified as nerds, geeks, dorks. A decent amount of skaters and bikers. A fair amount of just kids who said, I'm normal, I'm average, I'm regular. The techie group, into computers, like comics, anime, kind of like that. Kids who identified with all sorts of different groups. Kids who identified with hip hop culture. And then you get kind of most traditional jocks and popular. Okay, so the kids who are really into sports and identified with that, or the kids who just said, I'm popular, I'm with the cool kids, I'm well known was one. I was like, well, well known, are we? But yeah, so these were kind of some of the groups that we saw. Now here's some data from a group of young adults. This is through one of the waves of the Truth Initiative Young Cohort study, where we asked 18 to 24-year-olds which group they most identified with. And so you can see kind of some overlap directly with the crowds that we saw with the young people, maybe like a little bit of shifting where, you know, being the smart kid isn't really meaningful as a young adult if you're out of like a school context, but maybe like young professional is the next closest thing. So you can see here, religious, young professionals, homebodies, the three most common groups, and then kind of things get a little bit more esoteric as you move up the chart. Looking at, again, we see like goth, emo scene, some of the alternative music subcultures, and more alternative crowds. So this is important, not just because it's kind of fun to look at the youth, but because they vary in risk behavior, all sorts of different risk behaviors. But I'll show you some data on tobacco. So the data here are from a national sample. It wasn't very large. This is about 550 people from like 2012. But I like this chart because it paints a really clear picture of the gradients in cigarette use. So you can see like the mainstream crowd, and in this case, this would include like the smart kids, the academics, the nerds. Almost, you know, like 2/3 of them, more than 2/3, have never tried tobacco and are committed never smokers, with only 4.4% having tried in the past 30 days. And then as you kind of shift to the right, you can see the alternative crowd having a significantly higher rate of past 30-day and ever users. And then when we get to the hip hop crowd, you can see, you know, just how many, right? Like over 2/3, about 2/3 of this crowd have ever tried smoking. So it kind of gives us this new way of thinking about risk, right? And identifying at-risk groups. Some data from the happiness and health study, okay? I know this chart is a bit loaded, so I want to point out just a few of the key findings. Okay, so what we see here is that the deviant group is at higher risk for like all tobacco products. Hip hop is particularly high for little cigars and cigarillos. Alternative music is at high risk for cigarette use, kind of on its own. And then you get nerds at decreased risk for all. So if you have a kid, like, make them be a nerd, because they'll be in pretty good shape when it comes to substance use. And then just because e-cigarettes are such an interesting product to think about in terms of, is it encouraging young people to smoke? Is it keeping them from smoking? I just want to kind of point out two different patterns of e-cigarette use where we see like the deviant and the skater and bikers seem to be using e-cigarettes, and they're also at risk or already using combustible tobacco, whereas the kids who identified with like an ethnic group or with the popular group are not at elevated risk for combustible tobacco use, but they have been using e-cigarettes, right? So again, thinking about what's going on here and why do we see these different patterns could potentially suggest different motivations for use of products across the different groups. And then what it looks like in young adults, okay? So again, kind of like putting the crowds from left to right in terms of highest risk to lowest risk. I'll just point out a few kind of key features here. Skaters are high in cigarettes and hookah, like significantly higher in hookah use than the other crowds. The social and the hip hop crowd are high in cigarettes, LCCs, and e-cigarettes. The country crowd is high in cigarettes and also smokeless, which is kind of like a unique product. I didn't show you young adult or youth data for country, but other studies have found in youth, like country youth are significantly higher in smokeless tobacco. And then the preppy, artsy young professionals, religious, tend to be like pretty low in all products across the board. So some tobacco control efforts are using this to target their messages to high-risk audience segments. These are some images from some of FDA's new campaigns. Up here is the Fresh Empire campaign, which uses kind of hip-hop themes to really reach kids who are into that culture. And develop messages that resonate with them. And then the other two images are from the Real Cost Smokeless campaign, which uses data showing that like rural or kids who identify with the country group are at very high risk for smokeless tobacco use. And so all of the ads are trying to tap in to the values and the norms of that group. You can see the image on the right. Dip won't help you catch more bass. I never know how to say that. Like as a bass player, I'm always like bass, bass, but it can hook you. Okay, this is not a message that would resonate with probably like the popular crowd or the emo crowd. Okay, so they're very culturally specific messages. So when we use these types of messaging strategies, they should be more effective because they can reach the audience more effectively through targeted media. They can grab the audience members' attention because they're using relevant cultural cues like music or references to fishing or other things that are of interest. And then through use of these cues and relevant messages, they engender liking. Okay, so kind of like overcoming that barrier of reactance that we see so often when we try to message to young people. And then ultimately tap into the beliefs and attitudes of that group to change them against tobacco control, ideally working at a more macro level to change cultural norms so that smokeless tobacco use is no longer normative for youth who identify with the country crowd. And then just from kind of an economic perspective, this approach should be particularly efficient as well because you don't need to market as widely. You're not casting a wide net. You're getting very focused and targeted, giving materials to only the high-risk crowds through the very specific media and channels that they use. So that's really useful. But the bigger question, again, is why do these associations exist in the first place? So why country and smokeless tobacco? Why not, I don't know, like popular and smokeless tobacco? Okay, and for me, the answer is culture, connecting it back to the cultural system that infuses these tobacco products with meaning so that the young people can use them to signify their identity as a member of the country crowd or the hip-hop crowd or so forth, or just kind of establishing these products as normative for a particular type of person or lifestyle. So it's well documented that tobacco companies do this. I mean, like all marketing does this. This is good marketing, is to think about how your consumers identify themselves and align your product with that identity. So we have up here an older campaign, Cool Mix, where they really went hard trying to align their product with hip-hop culture. The bottom left is another image from the Camel Farm campaign that I mentioned earlier, kind of aligning it with like indie rock, the alternative music group. And then Skoal, right? This is very similar in sort of themes to the Grizzly ad that we looked at initially, right? Aligning it with this kind of like rugged, outdoorsy lifestyle. These people are going mudding. They're also using the product, okay? But beyond tobacco marketing, these products are also infused with meaning through like the larger cultural system and media system that we're exposed to. Gwyneth Paltrow, who like loves all things like, I don't know, like vegetables and organic and just as the picture of health, gave an interview with Harper's Bazaar in which she said her guilty pleasure is one light American Spirit cigarette. Now, why American Spirit? Why not Camel? Why not Marlboro, right? And the answer is probably because it's organic and therefore healthier, right? So you can see how that meaning is being reinforced here by this person. A tweet from Earl Dibbles Jr., country music and sweet tea, smokeless tobacco and Realtree, believing in God and being free. That's what America means to me, right? So this is like aligning smokeless tobacco use with all of these other cultural values. And then on the right is just a figure from some work from Sherry Emery's group in which they looked at tweets about little cigars, cigarillos, blunts, and kind of like how they aligned with hip hop culture. And it was exactly what they found, was that there were all of these kind of references linking hip hop culture to using little cigars and cigarillos and so forth, reestablishing that connection there. So to conclude, I want to kind of put up one of my favorite quotes from James Carey. Communication is a symbolic process whereby reality is produced, maintained, repaired, and transformed. So when we think about tobacco regulatory science that could inform tobacco marketing regulations and also tobacco education campaigns, we really need to move beyond just thinking about kind of like isolated message features, like the use of the term additive free, because ultimately it's kind of a game of whack-a-mole, because getting rid of additive free is great, but there's this broader system that can very readily be tapped into to communicate the same messages. So ultimately, we should be thinking kind of more holistically about both pro and anti-tobacco marketing, and how it connects to these broader macro level systems in which young people and the rest of us live. So thank you. Mm-hmm.
campaign, and just saw that there was this huge like discrepancy of like more likely to listen to country music, and so we kind of created a campaign that was specifically for COPD.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of COPD types of interventions and like informational types of events that were at music festivals, and so I thought that was neat, but like was seeing the same thing.
Yeah. And this was targeting adults? Yeah.
Yeah, so mostly adults, but I mean, kind of people from sort of middle age onwards to
Okay.
start to identify like some of the risk factors.
Okay.
And even if you quit smoking, kind of that you might be at higher risk for COPD.
Mhm.
But the other thing I thought was really interesting was that with e-cigarettes, it seems like there's not really like right now, and maybe it's because it's new, and so the market hasn't kind of fallen into like a niche cultural group.
Mhm.
So there's like this kind of free for all of all the groups maybe being
Yeah.
interested in seeing it. It seems like, you know, on the one side, like the ability to tap into that cultural significance from, you know, a communication perspective for anti-tobacco
Mhm.
is really powerful, but it's reactive in that case where there isn't really a cultural signifier that's popping out yet.
Yeah.
What can we do, or like, how can we think about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, one of the things I think that this kind of like underlies is the fact that there's probably like very different motivations for tobacco use. So the truth data, what we're working on now is a latent class analysis to kind of identify those patterns of use and look at, like, for example, who's using e-cigarettes in addition to what other products versus alone, which could tell us a bit about maybe some people are using them because the messaging, a lot of the messaging thus far for e-cigarettes has been about switching from combustible tobacco, kind of like these implicit, it will help you quit.
It seems like within your chart, it's more on the functional side.
Yeah, so like it could be because people are using it to quit, or they think that they are. It could be because they're addicted to nicotine and it's another nicotine delivery system. The fact that we saw those two groups that were only e-cigarette users makes me wonder how much of it is a social phenomenon as well. So I think like we just don't know anything right now, and we can look to the messaging to kind of see how it's being positioned. And you know, the next step would be to look at how exposure to that messaging and response to it results in product use. But yeah, one other interesting thing about e-cigarettes is vape culture, which I guess it's not quite a brand community, but it's a product use community in which people identify with the vape life. If you go hashtag vape life, right, you'll get this whole, you know, social media world of folks who are just, you know, into it. And one of the other interesting things from a regulatory perspective is that it's a very active community in terms of, you know, reaching out to FDA about potential regulations of e-cigarettes because they do not want this product, which many of them feel has helped them stop using combustible tobacco, to be regulated in a way that would, you know, make them not able to use it the way that they like. So, yeah. Yeah.
Megan, I agree that pop culture matters. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you.
The regulatory options for things like American Spirit and the idea of, you know, we focus on light and mild and misleading descriptors. If we were able to take away all those descriptors tomorrow from a brand like American Spirit, what do you think? Would it matter, or have they built a brand identity to this point? I mean, I guess that's a, you know, you can respond to that. And in light of that, what should we be thinking about more broadly in terms of regulation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, personally, I don't think it would make that much of a difference. And I guess we will find out. The study that I mentioned that we were working on involves like using standard ads and then removing, like, you know, images of a plant. And we may find that there's no effect on harm perceptions because it's a brand that people understand. And there's also a whole bunch of other features in the ad communicating the same thing. The regulatory angle is really interesting, and this is why we have like lawyers on the study team, because I'm not an expert in what FDA can and cannot regulate and like how the specific, I don't know, evidence comes into play, because, right, you run up against like the free speech laws, which is, you know, why can't a tobacco company use a picture of a leaf? It's just a leaf, right? So it's like that tension between the denoted meaning and the connoted meaning. There is kind of like a legal precedent for, I guess, like a reasonable interpretation or shared interpretation. The idea that, like, yeah, sure, so a leaf is not saying that this product is healthy, but to the extent that we can show that the large majority of consumers think that that's what the leaf means, right, then that kind of can stand on its own as a body of evidence. So I think it's really just about doing that, but also thinking about it like holistically, right? So like running lots and lots of experiments with all different sorts of combinations to isolate any synergistic effect or unique effect of these features. Yeah.
Megan, I'm not sure if I missed it, but the survey, is that going to be implemented globally, or is it just US-based participants that you'll send it to?
Just US-based. It's kind of a neat approach. We're going to use Amazon Mechanical Turk to recruit 6,000 people. So the Amazon Mechanical Turk, it allows people to kind of sign up to like work and do jobs. And so as a researcher, one of the jobs you could hire people for is taking your survey. So essentially it's just like a delivery system for sample recruitment. So we're going to focus on young adults here in this survey, and US only. But other than that, there's no like recruitment inclusion or exclusion criteria. Okay. Yeah.
And then another question. I can't remember what slide it was, but you were showing the self-reported categorizations or groups that, I don't know, was it youth or teens that they put themselves into?
They were high school freshmen.
High school. Were they only allowed to self-identify into one group?
So, okay, so for the happiness and health study, it was open-ended. We saw, I'm gonna say maybe about 40% reporting 2 groups. Maybe like 10% even had 3 groups. Sometimes the groups were fairly aligned, like jock and popular, for example.
I was curious about the hip-hop group, which had the higher number for, I can't remember what it was, if it was like initiation or having lax used or smoked a cigarette. Yeah. And I was curious if they also fell into some other group as well.
Yeah, so we haven't looked at kind of the effect of like multiple group identification yet, but in one of the other studies that I have, what we saw was that like groups that were kind of high risk, so to speak, contributed to an increase in harm. But then if they also identified with like a lower risk group, so like hip hop and nerd, then it kind of tamped down the risk so that you got kind of like a mean effect there. Yeah.
I was wondering, was there any mention? I'm sorry. Was there any mention of alternative groups when you were saying of the identifiers? Was there any mention of any the alternative group mentioning rolling their own tobacco with the American spirits? Because I know that some groups identify themselves as alternative by then rolling their own cigarettes.
Yeah, so for the happiness and health study with the teenagers, that was not one of the questions. But in the truth data set, I believe it's there, and we can look at it. Because I suspect the same thing, that we'll find that. One of the other kind of next steps for this work is looking at just differences in brands, right? Like, are different young people smoking different brands? You know, the hipsters smoking American spirits, like, or is that just some stereotype that's not real? Yeah.
So that's great, Megan. Thanks so much. You certainly covered a lot, and I've been like listening and thinking about the global implications because we do a lot of work in other countries, and of course you made you know, really strong argument about the importance of culture, and of course culture is going to vary across countries, and it may also vary quite a bit within countries. Well, we know that it does. But one of the things in tobacco control is that, you know, we've tried to identify the interventions that work no matter where you are. Like if you raise the price of cigarettes, you're going to, you know, reduce demand. And in related to health communication, I think as well, they've been trying to look at ads, sort of mass media campaigns that could resonate across multiple cultures. And so Vital Strategies has taken certain ads and have used them in multiple countries. So I'd really like to hear what you think about that, because it sort of it conflicts a little bit with what you're talking about, but maybe they're complementary. So I would just like to hear what
I think that it has to do with, I mean, like ultimately it's a numbers game, right? Like the resources that a country or a group has available, what we know is that like probably like the more culturally tailored, the more any type of targeted your message is, the more effective it will be, right? But it will be relevant to far fewer people, okay? So it's really about figuring out, like if we focus on the hip hop group, we know it's gonna be significantly more effective for them, but then we might not be doing anything for like the skaters. So who are we losing there, right? Ultimately to kind of come up with the estimated numbers of tobacco users prevented. So that's how I think about it. But I also think that for any campaign, you know, like placing the ad is one thing, right? Where if you're targeting it by placing it in specific channels, you're kind of necessarily limiting the reach to other people. But in terms of design, you can create ads that don't alienate with, like just because it connects especially well with hip hop culture doesn't mean that it alienates like mainstream youth or other youth. And I also think for young people in particular, there's kind of different levels of like cultural influence for each group, right? Where like some groups, like hip hop tends to be just a more ahead of the curve cultural group where these kids are really on top of all of the latest trends and norms. So the extent to which we might be able to shift the norm against tobacco in one of those influencer groups, we would expect to see it trickle down. But yeah, like ultimately the advice I would have is like run the numbers and think about how much more effective your targeted campaign will be in relation to who you're not reaching with it. Yeah.
I'll just add before passing along the mic. I think looking at brands will be really interesting, and looking at the interactions between the brand and some of these key symbols that you've been looking at. So, you know, Marlboro has an organics line. I don't know about in this country, but elsewhere, and others. So these companies are so good at trying to identify what trends are and how to address all the different subgroups and peer crowds. And so how much is it the organics versus, let's say, organic words or imagery versus the brand itself, and teasing those apart, understanding how people see those.
Yeah, for the Lippitt study, looking at the different American Spirit features, one of the things we've been going back and forth on is like we're going to have like a comparison condition, but should we go with a brand like Marlboro and see how the introduction of those descriptors, like for the American audience, affects it, or do we just go with kind of like a non-branded pack to remove any brand effect? Because yeah, the fact, like this is why it needs to be thought of as more than just like a single ad or a single tactic, because it's a much bigger picture and process that's occurred over decades, for example, that's given Marlboro this like super strong masculine meaning. And before it had that meaning, it was a very feminine cigarette that through media and marketing they were able to flip it. Yeah, anyway.